Quality is something that has been notoriously maybe not the best thing in the pork industry as a whole. People don't always see pork as the best tasting product. So one of the things Genesis has done over the last 20 plus years is actually breed for improved taste in meat. This is also a driver of income. If you're not buying it at the grocery store, we don't need to produce it, right? So one of the things I said that they've been doing for a very long time is investing heavily into consumer perception of the product. So that includes doing things like taste panels and other R&D related to flavor in pork. And the final is that the competitive cost of production is the most important. So obviously it's a profit-based business, as any industry is, but the overall sort of concept of the company is that we don't have to have the lowest cost of production to be competitive. Sometimes having the lowest cost doesn't always lead to having the best end product. So the philosophy is, as long as we're competitive in our cost of production, perhaps producers could get a little bit more money at the packing plant for those animals if the quality is there, leading to it still being a really profitable business. The other big thing I had to wrap my head around was health policies. So the dairy industry, it has a high biosecurity. Every livestock industry does. Pigs are a whole other level from what I was used to. I was used to going to dairy farms where they ask you, please don't bring outside clothes, put the little booties on, maybe wear a disposable coverall, if that. Whole other world with swine. I work with only high health herds, and we shower in, shower out, and bring absolutely nothing with us. Not even a watch is allowed in the farm. They're extremely strict on everything. We can't even bring coats in from the car. Everything stays in the car. Everything is left outside, and we're provided with a full set of clothes upon entering after we shower. This is really important. Swine health outbreaks can essentially decimate a herd. And I had not a lot of appreciation for that until I stepped into this. On our nucleus units, all of them are what they consider high health status. And we have rules between how you go through different farms if there are different levels of health status, and what we have to do, how many days you can't be on a farm before going to a next one. So because all of our nucleus units are the same health status, we can go to one every 24 hours. Except for things like our boar stud, it has to be 3 days without visiting another pig farm before you can go, just to ensure that we're not introducing other diseases. In addition to all of this on-farm sort of health practices, we also have sort of duplicated all of our nucleus units and put them at different geographical locations, which at the end of the slide, you'll see some of the places where they are. So what we have is that every breed has a minimum of 2 different locations, fairly geographically separated. We're not talking 10 kilometers down the road. The 2 nucleus maternal units I work with are over 100 kilometers apart. And some of our Duroc units are 200-300 kilometers apart. So that's to keep them geographically separated from each other in the event of a health outbreak that might be airborne. And the way that we keep them genetically connected is that we share semen among these nucleus farms. So every week I send enough semen to breed 6 to 10 females from the same boar to 2 different units. That way we know that there's a cross population of the genetics happening on these farms, and we can keep them linked better. The kind of claim to fame or cool thing about Genesis is that they hold most of the purebred registered animals in Canada for these 3 breeds. All of our purebred animals are registered federally, and about 80% of all registered Yorkshires in Canada are owned by Genesis, 84% for Landrace and 85% for Duroc. So I think that's just kind of a cool stat that I wanted to put in, that the company does have a lot of its purebreds here. The other really cool thing, at least I thought, is that of all of the different companies, we are the one that mates all of our sort of nucleus farms are based out of Canada and shipped elsewhere, as opposed to having multipliers in Canada with our base somewhere else in the world. So the overall goal of the company is to use genetics to maximize consumer profitability or customer profitability. The customers mostly for us are other pig farmers buying genetic stock into their farm, using our genetics on their farm, but it can also come right down to the consumer and buying what they end up buying in the store. So we like to focus on the whole chain. And we do that with a fairly substantial genetics team. There are 5 geneticists. Our boss is Bob Kemp, which some people on this call might know Bob. Bob is a Guelph grad from, I'll say, a couple of years ago at this point. As well as Everestus was a PhD student with Andy Robinson at Guelph. So some of the names might be familiar. Like I said, we have 5 main geneticists that work out of North America that deal with our North American and our Chinese herds or Asian herds. And they also participate in the R&D. We have a geneticist that's in the UK that deals with all of our European herds. And all of us provide weekly breeding and selection for them. We have a geneticist who works exclusively on carcass traits, and he's actually collecting the data, and we're using that. We have an IT personnel as well as a whole host of people that are involved as what we call our genetic technicians. So they're physically on farms, making sure that things are getting implemented properly and making sure data is being collected. So it's a pretty substantial operation with a pretty good team of people, I think. So I wanted to kind of take everybody through the data collection that we do. So we do 3 different stages. Essentially, we're collecting data right from these animals the day they're born to the day they end up leaving the farm, whether that's being sold or going to a processing plant. And so I wanted to take us through sort of the 3 kind of ways we look at that. The first is birth to weaning data, which is collected on both nucleus and F1 females. So we also look at crossbreds for this, which will come into play later when I talk about some of the research. But first things first, we record all the breeding records, who the service sire was, how many times she was bred, etc. We look at sow weight and back fat before they go into the farrowing crates and then after weaning to determine how much weight and back fat they're actually losing during lactation. We're recording lactation feed intake, litter size, individual birth weights on each piglet that's born, as well as the weaning weights for those piglets, and then their survival. And we're looking at the number of functional teats. And this one holds a special place for me because it's something I'm working on. Number of functional teats, I feel, is a really important thing because whether she's born with 16 teats is sort of irrelevant. How many of those teats actually work when it comes time to having those babies makes a big difference. Piglets can only absorb colostrum for the first 24 hours of life, and after that they can't anymore. So having enough teats to feed these up to 20 plus piglets that are coming out of these sows is really, really important. So this is something new that we've started collecting and implementing in our selection program. The other one that's not actually on here because it's that new is we're looking at animals that are born less than 1 kilo in size. And we're doing this because we want to improve the uniformity of the pigs as they are born. You don't want big pigs, but you also don't want really little pigs. Little pigs tend not to survive past a few days of age. So we're trying to make our piglets more uniform. Oh, I should also mention, in this section, there is 2 sort of selection stages that happen for our males. Right from when they're born. So the first thing we do is we identify litters to take tissue samples for genotyping from before they're even born. And then there's a set number of males that we'll take tissue samples from each litter, depending on sort of the average breeding value of those parents. That's our first selection decision. At that time, basically anything without a tissue sample is castrated. Only those with tissue samples will be taken on to move forward to become boar selection candidates. At weaning, when they move to nursery, is the second time that we make a selection decision on them, where we're looking again just at the males that are intact. At this point, we'll have their genotype results back, and we'll have rerun their evaluation with things like litter weights as well, weaning weights. And we'll make another decision on who gets to stay intact to move forward into our weaning through to our ending of what we call end of test program as boar candidates, both to stay on the farm, to go to the AI stud, or to be sold to customers. So we have a bunch of different selection points in here. We also look at females in the nursery in terms of who we think would be the best fit to be potential candidates to come back into our nucleus program for breeding. Once they sort of hit nursery, we don't really look at them for about 6 to 7 weeks from a genetics and data collection perspective. They get to grow up. And then at about 65 kilograms, which is about 6 to 7 weeks after they've hit the nursery, left the nursery, we weigh them. We do this for both males and females. At this point in time, the males get yet another selection step. So based on this data, we further refine that pool of candidates for selection to be continue on as boars. And we also subset out our males and females where some of them will go into a feed intake pens. I think we have 9 pens total. Right now, this is only on the Durocs, but there is work being done to put this into the maternal farms as well. And they stay there for a 7-week test where we're recording daily feed intake on all of those animals for that 7-week period, again, to look at things like efficiency. And then at the end of this test, which happens around 120 kilograms, all animals, males and females, no matter where they were, are weighed again. And we also take ultrasound measurements for fat depth, loin depth, and intermuscular fat. At that point is when the selection decisions happen for the final time in terms of what females are going to be brought back into the farm to stay, what females are going to be sold to our multipliers, and what females will end up ultimately going for processing. And same with the boars. We'll pick typically a boar a week per breed for the units I work with to stay back for being a breeding candidate. What boars will then get sold to customers and what boars ultimately will go to a packing plant. This is done, all this data is collected on the nucleus farms and the commercial farms, which makes this super interesting because we have it on both our purebred and crossbred animals, which is really helpful information. And finally, I talked a little bit at the beginning about the carcass and pork quality program. So as I'd said, it was 20 plus years of testing. I think 22,000 carcasses is probably really underestimated. I think they've got quite a bit more now. And we're doing both in-plant carcass and pork quality as well as the on-farm data. And this is also collected on all the pigs. What's really interesting here is we send animals, sex doesn't really matter at the moment, for our Duroc every week go through this process. I believe it's about 20 of them. And then every 3 weeks, we send 40 between York and Landrays purebreds to go through this. So we're doing meat quality on more than just what the typical terminal line would be for meat quality. We're doing it on everybody. Things that are looked at when it comes to pork quality, ultrasounds are all done on farm, so back fat, loin depth, and intermuscular fat. And then on the actual carcass, things like carcass weight, back fat, and loin depth, again, marbling score, loin color, and then loin pH at 24 hours are all collected at the packing plant by one of the Genesis employees. So that's sort of the data. The probably more exciting part for everybody here is the genomic evaluations. So I'll go through a little bit of the timeline of this. It's a little different than dairy cows, where genomics was off the gate pretty early. The swine industry sort of followed a little later. Then I'll talk a little bit about how we get all of our data into our evaluation and how that works, as well as the indexes that are used today. So the timeline to implementation started in 2009, actually started as a PERS project, and that didn't really have a lot of genomics. It was still fairly new at that time. It kind of continued with different things on feed efficiency and health and quality for carcass traits, all with different various groups, different universities and such, through to about 2016. And in 2016, Genesis created their own custom chip. That chip contains pretty much all the commercially available pig SNPs, as well as a handful of SNPs that they've deemed to be theirs and that they feel is really useful for our personal selection program. That chip started to be used in 2017, and all of this led through to 2018 when we first implemented single-step genomic evaluations, which we still use today. That said, today we're actually working on a new custom chip, where it'll have most of that old custom chip as well as, I think, like 10,000 new SNPs that have been found over the last 7-8 years. But that said, we have, again, I think 150,000 is probably a conservative estimate for number of genotypes. And we genotype about 500 animals a week. So that number grows quite quickly in our database. How do we actually do it from this is a not great, I will say, Kerry schematic of how this works. It's overly simplified, but bear with me. So on our nucleus herds, like I said, I went through all the records that we do, and every single animal on that farm is genotyped if it stays as a breeding candidate, every single one of them. males and females. So all of those genotypes go into our genomic database. All the phenotypes are in the phenotype database. But we also have a variety of phenotypes coming from our multiplier farms and our commercial farms. Not all of them collect all of the same data. Some collect some stuff, some don't. Some genotype, some don't. So we have a commercial farm that does genotype, which is great. And all of those genotypes and phenotypes also go to the respective databases. The genotypes are then used for two things. One is obviously to go into the evaluation to get our GBVs. The other is we use it for parentage and pedigree verification. So before we run our program every week, we check the pedigree based on the genotypes of, as every nucleus animal, there's a litter that will have, every litter will have somebody with a genotype, so we can check their parentage verification. And then if there's anything incorrect, we have a way to suggest who the likely parent is based on their DNA. And we modify the pedigree to then agree with what the genotypes are telling us. And that modified pedigree is actually what goes into the evaluation. So then the phenotypes, the modified pedigree, the genotypes all go into the fancy computer system, and out come our GBVs. And for the maternal animals, it's quite a few. This is fairly new. We actually just launched all these EBVs in July. So I was not a part of the development, but I am a part of the implementation of it. Before there was only a subset of maybe 5 of these traits in our program. Now there's quite a few more. The 3 biggest ones are going to be the top 3 there. Total number born, pre-weaning mortality, and litter weaning weight are the 3 biggest things we look at for the maternal lines, which are the Yorks and the Landrays. But we are also looking at paternal traits. So we look at things like, oh, that's not on here. I'm sorry, that's the next slide. In the maternal stuff, we still look at average daily feed intake and lactation, things like wean to service interval, age at first farrowing. As I'd mentioned before, number of functional teats is very important. We look at their back fat loss, loin depth, and weight loss. How many pigs are alive at 24 hours? That's pretty important. The number of pigs born alive that are less than a kilogram. As I said, we want to make them more uniform in size and not have as many little piglets. And then gestation length. On the paternal side, this is where we look at more of those growth and development traits. So how old are they at 120 kilograms? What's their average daily feed intake and average daily gain going from 65 kilograms to 120 kilograms, sort of that finisher stage? What is the fat depth, the loin depth, and the carcass, or the ultrasound, carcass weight, marbling? How long does it take to get them to 100 or to 65 kilograms, loin color, loin pH, all of those sort of maybe more classic paternal traits. And when we put them into an index together, we sort of have mixed them a bit in together as having, traditionally you would think of maternal lines having almost exclusively maternal traits in their index, paternal lines having exclusively paternal traits. We've readapted all of the dam line indexes, or the maternal indexes, to include both maternal and paternal traits. And the reason for that is to talk about having the improved meat quality in these female lines or maternal lines that typically isn't there. So unsurprisingly, the majority of the index for the landrays is on those 3 traits I mentioned: total number born, pre-weaning mortality, and litter weaning weight. That kind of makes up the most of it, for good reason. That's still the traits we want to focus on. But we have a bunch of paternal traits like age to 120 kilograms or age at 120 kilograms, carcass fat, marbling, etc. in there as well. And the York index looks slightly different. And that's because they are very different breeds. And what we've done is sort of weight the indexes so that where one breed might not be as strong, we can add extra weight there to help them out. And we're also able to highlight the things they're already really good at. So they contain all the same traits. It's just the weightings for the Yorks is a little bit different than the Landrays. And then for the Jersey Red Durocs, we use 2 selection indexes. One is sort of their selection index, or the sire line index. It has much fewer traits, with the big ones being days to 120 kilograms, average daily feed intake, and marbling. So they're a little bit more classic traits in there. But we also have a lean yield index, which is, depending on the market that we're selling into, sometimes more important. Same traits, just different weighting on them. So carcass fat is much more heavily weighted in here. same with sort of your growth traits. So it just weights it slightly differently depending on the market, depending where we're selecting the animals will depend on the index we use. And finally, some of the R&D stuff. So this is our R&D team photo from WCGIL. There are 6 of us that work in this sort of space. And I'm going to touch on some projects that were done sort of before my time, and then talk a little bit about a few that we're currently doing. So previous research projects, they've done a lot of work to optimize both of their sire and dam line indexes. The sire one was to improve growth rates later in life, sort of grow finish, and the dam line was to provide a more well-rounded and profitable animal. They've also looked at strategies for feed efficiency. So can we use genomic selection to use group feed intake records over individual feed intake records? And there's been quite a bit of work done in conjunction with Iowa State University on purebred versus pure and crossbreds combined, using those genetic parameters for reproduction and carcass traits to create crossbred sort of breeding value. So this work is not mine. This was done by my colleague, Chad. His picture's down in the corner. This was presented as his pitch slide at WCGIL. And the next 2 slides after this are also going to be the respective people's pitches. But what he wanted to look at is, are resilience indicators based on individual feed intake useful? Basically, are we able to use these indicators on a healthy pig to determine their resiliency if they become challenged with some kind of health challenge or stressor over time? So he had done some previous work and derived individual feed intake data, and we're able to correlate it with traits that were associated with resilience when these pigs were under a health challenge. And then he wanted to know, is some of the data that we routinely collect on our farms, A, was it going to be heritable enough to actually use in something like this? B, did it correlate well with both these resiliency traits and other traits? And was there a difference between a health stress and a climatic stress event? So a bunch of work was done, which I don't know all the ins and outs of, but I can put you in touch with him if you are interested. But essentially what he found was, yeah, it's heritable in both a high and low stress, whether that's based on health or based on a climatic change in their environment, and that we were actually able to measure resilient phenotypes on healthy animals, so we can potentially put that into a selection program. This is the start. I would say this is part 1 of the work, so part 2 is currently ongoing, and hopefully will help us later on. The second one I want to talk about was done by Everestus, another colleague of mine. He looked at multiple trait genomic estimation for Duroc pigs. He basically wanted to see, would the multiple trait genomics help us improving our parameters that we use in our evaluation? Overall, the answer was yes, which isn't overly surprising, I don't think, for most of us. But what I found interesting when I got to see this slide was it didn't actually improve every trait. Some traits, heritability's changed, which is understandable, but not in all cases was it more accurate, just in most. But we did end up actually implementing this, and all of our sire index traits are calculated now in a multiple trait genomic estimation parameter setting. So that was really interesting. And finally, Chen Yen looked at predicting the breeding values using individual versus group feed intake records. So this one I found the most interesting, coming from a feed efficiency background. And we use individual feed intake records for cows. So this was really interesting because it's just as expensive in pigs as it is in cows to measure individually. And it's really hard in pigs to measure it individually on a wide scale. What she essentially found is that it is possible to use the group feed intake records. However, you have to consider a bunch of other aspects. So if you're going to use group feed intake records, you need to have individual records on things like weights, ultrasound measurements, and ideally a genotype for all of those animals within that grouped pen. But we also still found that individual feed intake records were more accurate when selecting animals at a very young age. So this work is actually in the process of being written up to be published as well. Ongoing research projects, I had mentioned before the purebred versus purebred crossbred evaluation. That work was completed and has also been submitted from Iowa State. And so we are in the process of adapting our evaluations to create one of these purebred crossbred evaluations, so that's now being implemented. They are working on identifying genomic regions for novel meat quality traits on primal cuts and how to improve these. So again, this is in the process, but we're looking at genotyping animals as well as doing some whole genome sequencing on these animals to help with this, and that's in conjunction with the University of Alberta. The application of a Pig Gen Canada project, which was a health project that I unfortunately don't know a whole lot about, but based on the results of that project, one of our geneticists is working on creating breeding values for phenotypes that are linked to the gold standard for resilience phenotypes. And then the final three are actually my pride and joy. These are the things I've started to work on since coming into the company. So one of my projects is looking at the relationship of teat number at birth versus number of functional teats. I'd mentioned earlier why number of functional teats is so important, because it's something that directly relates to survivability of pigs. What we've been doing previously, however, is counting the number of teats for the piglet when they're born, and we have a specific cutoff that if any piglet has less than a certain number of teats, it's considered unselectable. What we want to know is that truly a good way to look at it? Or are we better off waiting until they're older, or potentially looking at another type of correlated trait to predict how many of those are functional? Or is the cutoff we're currently using okay? Should it be changed? Things like that. So that's one of my projects. The other one I'm looking at is determining the profit per pig on a GEBV basis. Ultimately, we're trying to do this for a commercial pig. So I've been working on the maternal line, next is the paternal line, and essentially trying to break down using the profit function and the indexes, exactly what sort of profit we'd be looking at based on their genetic potential. And the final one I'm working on is developing a phenotype and then ultimately an evaluation for sow longevity. And that's using many, many factors, including sow mature weight and other things like litter size, how many parities. But the goal is to have 5+ parities on sows in a commercial setting. And then I thought, since this is an audience of people who I used to be with a lot, and I was a student here, I would tell you a little bit about what it's like leaving academia and going to the industry and being a geneticist. So half my time I spend it working directly with farms. This is every single week. I'm in charge of all the Canadian maternal units. There are 5 that I work with, 2 nucleus farms, 2 purebred multipliers, and one that's an F1 multiplier who they're a closed herd, so they produce their own replacement purebreds, and I'm in charge of the mating of those animals. So I develop as long as implement all of the mating plans. Every week I tell them what boars to use, who to breed to, etc. The selection plans as well. The way that the selection plans work, it's a little different. I do tell them, hey, these are my top candidates. We actually have a team of selectors that then goes on the farm and will say to me, okay, out of your list of 5 boars, 2 are really good. What one? And then I have to pick. Or he goes, yeah, there's only one that physically looks good, because obviously sitting at a computer in Ontario, I don't know what the pig in Manitoba looks like. So I think it works really well that we have this relationship where they're physically seeing perhaps a leg deformity or something that I can't see, but on paper, this might look like a really good animal. So we work together a lot. The other thing I do is I do a lot of data collection, quality control. And man, the dairy cattle database we have here is amazing. It's so clean compared to farm data where you're calling a farmer going, so what did you actually do? How did you actually count that? I have a big appreciation for data cleaning now, but I do a lot of that quality control every week. And then I visit the farms 3 to 5 times a year. I'm actually physically there on the farm, looking at pigs, talking to the producers, and they're a really great group that I get to work with. The other half of my time is spent pretty much doing R&D. As I talked about, I work in sow traits and economic indexes. And this is a lovely picture of a group of us that work for the company that were out this summer in Manitoba for one of their events. So this is sort of where I go. It's a map of Manitoba, part of Manitoba. Genesis head office is right here in Winnipeg, one of their head offices. The other is in Oakville. Not Oakville, Ontario, which is what I thought the first time when I got the business card. It's Oakville, Manitoba, population about 300 people. But then all of these little dots, there's one up here and a few around here. These are some of our farms. So way out here is our boar stud. It's about 3.5 hours away from Manitoba, from Winnipeg. and it's where I get to go first thing Monday morning this week. And the rest are some of the maternal units that I work with. So they're all, you can see, they're all fairly well spread out, kind of all over the place. And I had said it's on purpose. They're in the middle of nowhere on purpose. It's to help with herd health, but that's where I get to go. And I've been warned with their winters that it's very cold, so to pack a parka. And the last thing I'll say before I go, which I took this from Erin's presentation, is some advice that I probably should have given myself as a PhD student. The first one is trust your training. You know what you know. You also know what you don't know. And there's no shame in saying you don't know. I've told a lot of producers, hey, I'll get back to you, and then called my boss and been like, I don't know what to tell them. Help. I've done that a lot. But you also will sit there and realize, you know, you really do know things. And when we have discussions on things like how to change models, how to improve models, should this be a fixed effect or random effect? What about this contemporary group? How to handle this? You know, all of those classes and all the things I learned here sort of came back to mind, and it was better than I thought, and I knew more than I thought. This is something Erin also said, and I agreed with, so I wanted to put it here. No one good is good enough. It's something we don't do much in academia. We strive for absolute perfect all the time, but in industry, things happen really, really fast. So while I worked for 3 years on one part of my PhD, I've had to pump projects around in less than 6 months. So sometimes you have to make sure it's as academically and as scientifically correct as it can be, but it's never going to be perfect before it has to be implemented, because implementation can take another year, and customers, you're always competing with your other competitor industry companies that are also working on very similar things. The other big one is to learn other programs, and I thought I knew programs. Nope. So I use R every day, learn R. But I have not used Unix or Bash coding or any other coding since leaving the university. I do everything in Excel and Access, Microsoft Access. That is how all and SQL databases, learn SQL databases. That is how all of their stuff is done. I still don't understand how to use Microsoft Access. I know it enough that I can do what I need to do to get my stuff done, but I'm still learning how to format things. So learn more than just 2 or 3 programs. A big other one is cross-discipline and cross-species training. I spend, as I said, most of my weeks, the majority of the people I talk to are producers. And so knowing how to talk to them, knowing how to ask them questions, and knowing how to listen to them and come up with solutions that actually work on farm is a huge task. And it's one that I'm still learning how to do, because typically in an academia setting, you don't get to do that. So take every opportunity to go to a farm and talk to actual producers to know what their needs are. It's really, really important. The other one is cross-species training. And I didn't understand this till I left dairy. I'd only ever been to dairy-only conferences until I got the chance to go to WC-GALP. And it opened my eyes to the fact that there are so many things that we do in dairy that are done in other species. There's also so many things done in other species we don't do in dairy cattle. And I think having the opportunity to go to conferences that have more than one species and making sure that you attend talks that are for more than one species is so, so important. It also shows you how small the genetics world really is, because at WC-GALP, I was running into people who I knew from the dairy world who were in swine and poultry talks because they knew the speaker. So it's always it's a small world. And the last one is never say never and never say no. So I always thought I'd work in dairy when I was done school. Clearly I don't. But moving to the swine industry was probably one of the best things I could have done. I've learned a ton. I have a lot of fun working with these people. But also don't say no to opportunities. If you see a job application that might look good to you, apply for it. If there's something that comes up that might be of interest, just try it. I think that's the best advice I can probably give. And with that, I thank you for listening. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them now, or I'll leave my contact information up, and feel free to send me an email. Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, thank you very much, Kerry. And now you online, if you have a question or something you want to interact with the speaker, please raise your hand in the Microsoft Teams that we'll be able to see it. And also here in the room, if you have any question to Kerry, please go ahead.
last question.
Doesn't look like it yet.
So I can start.
Thanks, Kerry. Great to see you again. It's been a while. My question was more related to exactly the picture you have there. How is the industry, at least in Canada now, changing towards having more fat and pork meat? Because we had this trend in the past 10 years of like getting leaner and leaner and leaner, but now it's coming back.
So it's coming back in sort of a, so I will preface this by saying I don't work with the carcass traits at all, but I'll give you the best answer I can. It's coming back not as back fat. I think that's the thing, is they still want leaner back fat, but more marbling, which of course are unbelievably correlated together, right? One goes up, the other goes up. So breaking that correlation is definitely tough. I think the biggest thing, like when you look at this picture on the screen, that's of a purebred Jersey Red Duroc. So that's a purebred animal. You can see the marbling in it. The Yorks and the Landrays don't have that. So that commercial product still isn't there yet, which is why we've started to add it in. But I think that's what they're trying to do, is up the marbling, but not have such lean animals, or sorry, have leaner animals, but up to the marbling. It also comes into play when we look at farrowing. I remember there was a talk at WC Gallup where like the sows coming out of farrowing had basically zero back fat, none. And a woman saying, you know, how is this even physiologically possible that they're doing this? And it's almost unhealthy. Like we went too far one way. We got to kind of come back to the middle. So that's sort of, at least in Genesis, what they're doing is we have a positive weight in the index on marbling with a negative weight on back fat, to try to combat that. It's hard. It's really hard. That's what I'll say, is it's definitely not easy, but they are seeing a swing, as I said, back towards a little bit more fat in the meat.
Okay, I think I see. Shinkel, do you have a question?
My only comment would be,
You.
Here I am.
the other question would be that the bellies are very valuable, and to have a belly that's an inch thick, then you have to have an animal that is more fat.
Absolutely.
And so what we've done in the United States, we keep the belly, used to be 13% of the value, is about 30% of the value of the carcass, and it's a lot of value added. And the value of the hams and loins has actually gone down, certainly as a percent. So they keep wanting, if I've done models with the Canadian marketing system for people, stochastic models, but they really want pigs just right at 17 millimeters. And,
Okay.
and what we've done now is just increase the market weight and increasing the slaughter weight so that the bellies are an inch thick. And if the bellies aren't an inch thick, they really get discounted because they're not a grade A belly. So now pigs are going at 290 pounds. But you'll
That's
see
really interesting.
when you
Go ahead.
when you do your genetic correlations of your cut weights, the percent belly is highly correlated with the back fat, like 0.7. So if you make leaner pigs, you're gonna the fat in the belly is the last to be positive. So I've done a lot of carcass dissection and all that other stuff many years.
Okay, so as we wait, perhaps we have more people online that would like to ask a question. I have a question to Kerry, but it's not part of what you presented. It's something I have studied in the past,
Okay.
and I was just wondering how, if it is in there. So Bortane,
Mhm.
and I I had the opportunity to work a little bit on that. So I was wondering if is that a concern still in place, and if there's anything going on
So
considering that.
in Canada, no, we slaughter way too early. There's also intact boars don't get very much money at the market. So there's products such as Impervest that they'll put into older boars that are sort of too old to castrate. So it's a type of chemical castration. It's currently legal in Canada. In other places in the world, it's not. So it's a little bit more of a concern for like the EU market, the UK market, where they are slaughtering at a little bit heavier animal. At least that's today. But at this point, it doesn't seem to be a concern. It was brought up. We have an R&D meeting every fall. It was brought up, and it sort of seemed that from the upper management, they didn't feel it was a concern because of how old pigs are when they're being slaughtered. Will it become a concern in the future with other potential regulatory things? Probably. But as of today, it's not something that's on the radar, at least not that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you. And we have Stephanie Lamb. Please go ahead.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, Kerry. It's really nice to see you, and I absolutely agree with your post-grad advice. Take every opportunity and learn as much as you can. So it's really nice to see you back and show what you're doing. I have two questions. I have some experience from working at AAFC in Alberta with pork quality traits. So I know it's not your area that you're working on right now, but I was wondering if you might know that quality in terms of color and marbling are currently scored by packers using subjective methods. So looking at a scorecard with the human eye, and there's a lot of potential for improving efficiency and accuracy in those traits. So I'm not sure how they're measuring it there, but is there potential for maybe more newer advanced technologies to measure those traits? And then I'll let you answer that and then I'll ask another question.
Okay, so from my understanding now, again, not my area, and I have yet to get to go to the packing plant, maybe next trip out, is we have one person that does all of our scoring. So I'm fairly sure he's doing it visually for marbling, as you said, but at least we're limiting it in terms of the number of people from a data perspective to just one person that does all of that. From a increased technology perspective, I would say for like us as a company, it's probably not the world's highest priority just because we're not doing a ton of animals. So for one guy, it's not so bad. From an industry perspective, I completely agree that having less variation is probably better. What that would be and how you would do it, I'm probably not the person to answer that question though.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, that helps a lot. There's also this other, I don't know, elephant in the room in the pork industry where producers don't get paid for quality traits, and packers are paid for quality traits. So how is that considered in your program?
So again, tough to answer a little bit because we are selecting on quality. Who we define as our customer is a little complicated. So we have customers that are packers. So we will have packers who approach us and say, we only want to slaughter genetics from this company because we get paid on quality, because we sell to XYZ, grocery chain, probably a high-end chain, where I can get that kind of money because they're willing to pay for that quality. From the producer standpoint, it's a little bit more of a challenge. So we don't necessarily look as much, I don't want to say we don't look at quality because that's not true. We sort of promote that through the whole chain, but you're going to look at other things like how long does it take to get to fully grown? Are we able to reduce days to slaughter weight? that kind of stuff, which makes it more profitable for the producer still. And, you know, maybe one day there's some forward looking in some of these indexes, right? Because today we might not get paid on something, but that doesn't mean in 5, 10, 15 years from now, they won't get paid on it. And to have an animal that is primed for that is going to take, you know, 5, 6, 7, 10 years. So selecting today is sort of selecting for maybe 5 to 10 years down the road in terms of what the company thinks or where they think the industry might go, so that when they get there, you have that sort of animal that's ready to go, ready for the market. I guess that's sort of the idea behind it is, you know, we're breeding for today, but also breeding for what we hope ideally will be the structure in the future. Whether it gets there or not, check back in 10 years, I guess.
That's great. Thanks, Kerry.
Thanks, Stephanie.
All right. Does anyone else have a final question to our speaker, Kerry? If you do, please raise your hand on the Microsoft Teams so we can see it. Okay, so if not, I would like to once again thank you, Kerry, for presenting for us today and for providing this wonderful presentation on the overview of what you have done. Hopefully in the future you can come back and share a little more on the update on those projects. So thank you very much. Thank you all in the audience to joining us today, and I will see you all next Friday.